Edmund Joseph Sullivan was born in London in 1869, the son of a successful Victorian painter. But rather than tread the same path as his father, he gravitated in his teens towards the graphic arts and illustration rather than oil painting. At the age of only 19, he got a job working for the Daily Graphic magazine, producing illustrations for news stories. And after 5 years there, he moved to the Pall Mall magazine in 1893, where he also began illustrating fiction, and that's where he really began to find his way. In 1895, he illustrated a collection of English verse, which led rapidly to more commissions for bookwork. One of the earliest, and certainly one of the most successful of these, was Lavengro, written by George Borrow, and published in 1896. Sullivan was already an astonishingly accomplished and expressive pen and ink illustrator, and at this point all his work was monochrome. But given the dynamic and dramatic qualities of his line work, the absence of colour mattered little. From this point on, it's impossible to keep up with the torrent of illustrations Sullivan created, so I'll just pick out some of the highlights. In 1896, his illustrated edition of Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus was published, and it featured a large number of suitably dark and frequently grotesque images throughout. And in this book, the personification of death made an early appearance, and would become almost compulsory in anything Sullivan subsequently embarked on. And this fondness for mournful and sinister imagery made him the perfect choice to illustrate the poems of Tennyson in 1900. He illustrated several stories by H.G. Wells, including A Modern Utopia in 1905. And in 1910 he created a series of particularly gruesome images for Thomas Carlyle's brutal account of the French Revolution. On a lighter note, he also illustrated an edition of Shakespeare's comedies, published in 1911. His illustrations for the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam were published in 1913, and the book was reprinted numerous times. This volume in particular provided Sullivan with ample opportunity to give a starring role to what was evidently his favourite character. Among them was this illustration, which was shamelessly stolen for a Grateful Dead poster in 1966. As I'm sure you've noticed, all his work up to this point had been monochrome, but in 1914 Lavengro was published again, and this time it included a dozen watercolour full-page illustrations alongside the monochromes. This wasn't his only foray into colour, but there weren't that many others, and it was line illustration which continued to remain at the heart of his popularity. He used his skills for scathing and particularly nightmarish satire in 1916 in a collection of wartime images called The Kaiser's Garland, which attacked Prussian militarism and Kaiser Wilhelm's belligerence. Once again, the personification of death, but in several appropriate appearances. Strangely, in the years following the war, all evidence of Sullivan's work disappears, and the only other book which can be verified is Towards the Light, which was published in 1932. And a year later, Edmund Sullivan died at the age of only 64. Werner Hahmann was born in 1883 in Chemnitz in Germany, and having shown early talent for all things visual, he went on to study architecture and art in Dresden, Munich and Paris. Consequently, it was 1910, when he was already 27, that he began a career as a painter and printmaker. He had some success with his etchings in particular, but in 1914 he also started to submit satirical drawings to the magazine Kladderadatsch. Very quickly he became a frequent and regular contributor. The First World War had just begun, and his drawings during the conflict, just like those of his colleagues at the magazine, were blindly patriotic and scathing about the enemies of the Kaiser. Once the war was over, the tone of Harmen's work predictably became less bombastic, but continued to criticise the Allied nations for their supposedly rough treatment of the defeated Germans. Like those of most of his contemporaries, Harmen's magazine illustrations were created directly onto lithographic stone with brush and wax crayon, and if colour was used, it was applied through a series of usually flat colour print runs. All his illustrations displayed clinical precision, and when combined with the particularly well-chosen spot colours, they all had immense graphic clarity. As early as 1930, his work began to feature anti-Semitic sentiments, which were already widespread throughout Germany. And when the Nazis came to power in 1933, Harmen and his colleagues sang their praises for the Führer's mission and appeared to be trying to outdo each other in terms of just how anti-Semitic they could be. This and the hostility to the other countries of Europe continued throughout the decade, and when the war began in 1939 it grew ever more intense and didn't let up until Kladderadatsch collapsed in 1944. And at that point all trace of Harmen disappears. German Wikipedia makes no mention of his anti-Semitism or staunch support for fascism, and it also doesn't give any clues about what he did in later life. There are widely differing assertions about how much later life he had. Some sources assert it was 1952 and others 1977 when he died. The latter seems to have the most support, but if it was 1952, that would at least explain why there was no more work after the war. Of the many forward-looking graphic artists working in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, Charles Lupo is undoubtedly one of the least appreciated. He was born in Nice on the French Riviera in 1892, but in 1905 the family relocated to Lausanne in Switzerland. At the age of 18 he returned to France to study at the School of Fine Art in Lyon. As soon as he graduated, the Great War broke out and he enlisted in the French army. Not much later he was wounded in battle and sent home to Switzerland to recover. So in 1917, at the age of 25, he began working as an illustrator and designer for a number of Swiss print and publishing companies. Most of this was poster work for fashion houses, and he created some remarkably atmospheric gestural images, which were both expressionistic and modernist. In 1923 he returned to France, and although he had more fashion work published in La Gazette du Bon Temps, by now he was first and foremost a poster artist. The printers de Vombre were particularly keen to exploit his talent for eye-catching stylish posters, and Lupo happily obliged with diverse and highly imaginative illustrations for a wide range of high-profile clients from different areas of commerce and industry. His association with de Vombre turned out to be shorter than expected, when only a couple of years later a new company, Les Belles Affiches, was established and Lupo was hired as their creative director. Soon after his appointment, the wine company Etienne Nicolas approached him to modernise their brand, and he responded with a suitably contemporary and visually distinctive campaign. By this point his reputation was well established and attracting yet more advertising work for any number of prestigious clients. In terms of both his stylistic approach and his use of media, he was particularly eclectic, and his figure work and visualization of pictorial elements in general explored varying levels of abstraction and representation. There's no definitive information on what paint he used, but the best guess is gouache or tempera. It was usually but not always applied opaque, and he combined flat and tonal elements using dry brush techniques and probably an airbrush. But whatever his methods and media, the results were never less than compelling and aesthetically considered. In 1931 he began a collaboration with A.M. Cassandra's graphic studio, but after 4 years they went their separate ways again. In 1935 he was commissioned by the aperitif company San Rafael, and once again he demonstrated his ability to reinvent corporate images and boost sales. The relationship was so successful it endured for decades, and it only ended when Lupo died. All his work was interrupted in 1940 when France was occupied by German forces, and he retreated to the countryside and kept his head down until the Allies had driven the Germans out. Once the war was over, it took him a few years to rebuild his reputation and client base, but by 1950 he had established his own advertising agency in Paris. And throughout the following decade he continued to enjoy great commercial and creative success. But unfortunately Lupo became ill in the late 1950s and he reluctantly retired. Not much later, in 1962, he died at the age of 70. I'm not sure how I managed to leave it this long before including British cartoonist and illustrator Leslie Illingworth, given how much his work meant to me as I grew up. He was born in Barry in Wales in 1902, and in his teens he found work at the Western Mail newspaper. In 1921, and still only 18 years old, he won a scholarship to the Royal College of Art in London. A few months later he was offered the job of chief cartoonist at the Western Mail, and he accepted the offer on condition he could send his work from London. Surprisingly, they agreed to this, and he engaged an agent in London who quickly found him commissions on top of his official job with the Mail. In 1927 he had his first illustration for Punch magazine published, but instead of building on his growing reputation, he impulsively left for the USA, followed by stays in Berlin and finally Paris. His absence seems to have not done him any professional harm, and on his return to Britain almost 4 years later, Illingworth picked up where he'd left off with all his former clients. He'd begun his career as a monochrome illustrator, using pen, brush and black ink with great control. He used selective areas of hatching to create solidity and lighting effects, but he instinctively knew when to leave well alone, and it was never overdone. When it came to colour, he was no less expressive. A lot of his illustrations for Punch, including cover art, were printed in full colour, and although he still used an ink line as the basis of the work, he skillfully applied the washes of watercolour to solidify and add detail to both his almost representational figures and highly plausible, closely observed scene setting. In 1939 he took over the prestigious role of chief political cartoonist at the Daily Mail newspaper. And throughout the Second World War he created 4 black and white cartoons a week which reflected on the conflict. But he was also continuing to create a lot of work for the pages of Punch in colour and in monochrome. And when the war ended, Illingworth continued to hold down 2 supposedly full-time, very well-paid jobs at the Daily Mail and Punch, and still managed to find time to take commissions from other magazines. These were used regularly to illustrate light-hearted serialised fiction throughout the 50s and 60s. Meanwhile, his newspaper work made visually eloquent commentary on more serious global matters. After a half-century of remarkable productivity, Leslie Illingworth finally retired in 1969, and he died a decade later in 1979 after suffering a stroke at the age of 77. That's it for now, and as ever I hope I'll see you next time.